What was the worst year to live in during the Middle Ages? Was it when the sun set, causing a global famine, or was it when the Black Death ravaged the world? The truth is, the competition is fierce. In this video, you'll discover the 6 worst and deadliest moments of the Middle Ages. But this isn't just a video about suffering. It's also a story of human ingenuity and hope, how communities found ways to endure, protect themselves, and even find moments of laughter through humor and ritual in the worst of times. We'll explore the flagellants' processions, the invention of the first quarantine measures, the bizarre remedies plague doctors used, and the way people preserved food to make it through long winters and famines. So buckle up and prepare yourself for a journey back into one of the most harrowing periods of history, where every year brought new threats and survival became an art form. Don't blink. You'll want to stay until the very end. In the spring of 541 AD, the glittering capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, began to tremble beneath an invisible enemy. The streets, once filled with merchants, priests, and the echoes of church bells, fell silent. Ships arrived from Egypt carrying not gold or grain, but death. Rats poured out of their hulls, and with them came fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would soon claim the lives of tens of millions. Within weeks, the greatest city of the Mediterranean turned into a graveyard. Procopius, the court historian of Emperor Justinian, wrote that the bodies of the dead were too many to count. At the height of the outbreak, 5,000 people died every single day. By summer, the city could no longer bury its dead. Mass graves overflowed. When there was no more ground to dig, bodies were stacked inside towers and covered with quicklime to stop the stench. The emperor himself caught the disease, fever, swollen buboes, and delirium, yet miraculously survived. But his empire would never truly recover. Trade routes collapsed, crops rotted in the fields, armies deserted their posts as fear spread faster than the plague itself. In the following years, the disease swept through Egypt, Syria, Greece, Italy, and Spain, erasing entire villages from the map. Historians estimate that between 25 and 100 million people died, nearly half of the population of the Eastern Roman world. For the first time in history, humanity faced a pandemic on a truly global scale. The symptoms were horrifying: fevers that burned like fire, black pustules bursting on the skin, hallucinations, vomiting blood. Men and women died within days, sometimes within hours. Caravans vanished in the desert. Monasteries became silent tombs, and the bells of Constantinople rang without ceasing, a city-sized dirge for the dead. Procopius believed the plague was divine punishment for the sins of humankind. Others whispered darker theories, that the world itself was ending. When the skies filled with strange clouds and the sun dimmed in later years, it only reinforced that fear. But even amid this nightmare, the human instinct to survive did not vanish. By accident, the Byzantines laid the foundations for something revolutionary: quarantine. Without understanding germs or contagion, officials ordered the sick to remain indoors, guarded by soldiers. Doctors began keeping notes of symptoms and timelines, trying to understand why some lived while others perished. Their records, crude but systematic, became the earliest studies in epidemiology. Religious life also transformed. As the streets filled with corpses, churches overflowed with those seeking divine mercy. Processions carrying icons of saints like Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch became common. Both would later be remembered as protectors against plague. New hymns, prayers, and rituals emerged, some still sung today in Orthodox liturgies. Economically, the plague broke the empire's spine. Fields lay abandoned, trade collapsed, and food became scarce. Labor shortages forced landowners to free serfs to survive, reshaping the structure of Byzantine society. Centuries later, historians would note that the Plague of Justinian weakened the empire so deeply that it never fully recovered, paving the way for the Arab conquests that followed. And yet, through all this horror, art and knowledge endured. In monasteries untouched by the plague, scribes continued to copy ancient Greek and Roman texts, preserving the wisdom that would one day fuel the Renaissance. The world was burning, but humanity somehow refused to let its memory die. The Plague of Justinian was more than just a tragedy. It was the first great lesson in global vulnerability. It showed how a single microscopic enemy could bring empires to their knees. And in the ashes of fear and faith, it planted the first seeds of modern science. It began with rain. Soft, endless rain that fell not for days but for years. By the summer of 1315, Europe's skies had turned to a curtain of grey, and what should have been golden fields of wheat became seas of mud. At first, farmers waited for the sun to return, but the sun did not return. From England to France, from Flanders to the Rhineland, the same story unfolded. Crops drowned before they could ripen. Granaries emptied. Prices soared. A bushel of wheat that once cost 1 shilling now sold for 4. Bread, the foundation of the medieval diet, became a luxury even nobles could barely afford. Chroniclers recorded the misery in chilling detail. Men and women, one monk wrote, wandered the roads like ghosts, their faces pale as ashes. People slaughtered their horses, ate dogs and cats, and boiled tree bark to make bitter soups. They scraped moss from stones, chewed leather belts, and dug up roots like starving animals. In some villages, desperate parents abandoned their children in forests, praying someone, anyone, would feed them. This is the age that inspired the later tale of Hansel and Gretel, born from real memories of hunger and fear. The climate itself had betrayed humanity. For centuries, Europe had basked in what historians call the medieval warm period, a time of mild weather and abundant harvests. But around 1315, the warmth vanished. Cold fronts swept in from the North Atlantic. Rains drowned the lowlands, and snow fell where summer should have been. What followed became known as the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift that would torment Europe for generations. By 1316, the famine deepened into something biblical. Entire herds of cattle died from disease. Grain rotted before it could be stored. In some regions, up to 15% of the population perished, not from plague or war, but from simple, relentless hunger. Even kings were not spared. The household accounts of King Edward II of England show his own court struggled to find bread and wine. With no food and no hope, Europe descended into chaos. Theft and violence exploded as starving peasants raided monasteries and granaries. Roads became dangerous, not from soldiers but from the hungry. In the chronicles of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, monks wrote of travelers murdered for a loaf of bread. And yet within this horror, there were flickers of human resilience. Communities learned to improvise. They boiled animal bones for broth and scraped marrow for calories. They learned to ferment what little grain they had, creating early forms of preserved beer and sourdough. In the north, people discovered that birch bark, when dried and shaved thin, could be boiled into a syrup rich in sugar and starch, a desperate innovation, but one that saved lives. Churches held special processions, begging God to stop the rain. But when the heavens remained closed, faith itself was tested. Some priests declared it was punishment for human sin. Others preached that the world was entering its final days. And still, the rain fell. By 1317, the famine's grip began to loosen. A few harvests survived, the clouds broke, and sunlight returned to the ruined fields. But the damage was done. Europe had changed forever. When the famine ended, the survivors were leaner, harder, and far more cautious of nature's moods. Agricultural practices shifted. Farmers diversified crops, built drainage systems, and began recording weather patterns. Even medicine changed. Doctors began associating nutrition with disease, an early step toward modern health science. But the scars ran deep. Population growth halted for decades. The weakened and malnourished would soon face an even greater enemy, the Black Death, just a generation away. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 was not just a natural disaster. It was a warning, the first tremor before Europe's greatest catastrophe. And it showed once again that in the Middle Ages, survival was never guaranteed, not even when all you asked for was bread. On the shores of the Black Sea in the Crimean Peninsula stood the wealthy port city of Caffa, a bustling hub of merchants, sailors, and fortune-seekers under the banner of the Genoese Republic. Its markets overflowed with silk from China, spices from India, and slaves from the Eurasian steppes. In the spring of 1346, its walls gleamed white in the sun, until the horizon darkened with the banners of the Mongol army. The Mongols, led by Janibeg Khan, had come to reclaim the city after years of tension with the Genoese traders. Their siege began, like many others, with catapults, arrows, and fire. But soon, something far deadlier spread through their camps. Soldiers began to sicken and die, their bodies covered in black boils, their breath rattling with fever. The disease struck fast, leaving corpses piled around the tents. The Mongols had encountered something unseen, something monstrous. It was the plague, the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, that had once ravaged the Roman world 8 centuries before. But this time, it had evolved into a killer of unimaginable speed. As the Mongol soldiers fell by the thousands, Janibeg Khan realized the siege was lost. But before retreating, he ordered one final act, an act that would echo through history. Chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, writing years later, described it in horror. They hurled the bodies of the dead over the city walls with catapults in an attempt to infect the Christians inside. The defenders of Caffa watched in disbelief as bloated corpses rained from the sky. The stench was unbearable. Soon after, people within the walls began to cough, swell, and bleed. The disease had found a new home. Modern scientists believe this event marks the first recorded use of biological warfare in human history. Whether intentional or desperate, the result was catastrophic. When the Genoese realized their city was doomed, they fled by ship, carrying with them their gold, their goods, and the plague. The rats that hid in the cargo holds and the fleas that clung to them became the grim messengers of death. By 1347, ships from Caffa arrived in Constantinople, Genoa, and Marseille. Within months, the disease had leapt from port to port, following trade routes across Europe. What began as a siege in Crimea soon became a continental apocalypse. Eyewitnesses wrote of entire households dying overnight. In Caffa itself, the Mongols withdrew, leaving a silent city behind, its streets lined with corpses, its harbor filled with ghost ships drifting aimlessly. The few survivors who escaped carried more than memories. They carried the seeds of a pandemic that would erase nearly half of Europe's population. But amid the horror, something remarkable emerged. Humanity, facing an invisible enemy, began to develop new ideas about disease and prevention. In 1377, the city of Dubrovnik, then Ragusa, created a new rule for sailors. They had to wait 30 days outside the port before entering, later extended to 40. That word, 40 giorni, 40 days, gave birth to the term we still use today, quarantine. The Siege of Caffa, intended as a simple military conquest, had unleashed the deadliest biological chain reaction in human history. It connected distant worlds, Asia, Africa, and Europe, in a single web of contagion. And in doing so, it exposed the fragility of medieval civilization. The irony is chilling. The age of exploration and trade that had once promised prosperity instead carried ruin on its sails. From a single battlefield in Crimea, the Black Death was born. In the years that followed, priests would call it divine punishment, doctors would call it bad air, and peasants would call it the end of the world. But historians now know the truth. It began here, at the Siege of Caffa, when mankind learned that even the dead could still kill. By 1348, death had become a familiar traveler. It moved with the merchants, sailed with the sailors, and walked through the streets of Europe disguised as a cough, a fever, or the faint bite of a flea. The Black Death, as it would later be known, had arrived. It entered through the ports of Genoa and Marseille, spreading inland like wildfire. Within months, France, Italy, and England were drowning in silence. No army, no king, no saint could stop it. The world had faced famine before, had seen wars and plagues, but nothing like this. This was annihilation made visible. The disease struck in 3 terrifying forms. First came the bubonic plague, the most common. Black, swollen lumps formed under the arms and between the legs, pulsing with infection. Then the septicemic plague, which turned the skin black as the blood thickened and died. Finally, the pneumonic plague, the most merciless of all, spread by breath alone. It could kill within 24 hours. If you saw a neighbor alive in the morning and dead by nightfall, you knew the plague had come to your street. Contemporary witnesses left accounts that chill the blood even today. In Florence, the poet Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of bodies piled in the streets, neighbors avoiding one another like enemies. In London, over 60,000 people died within a few months. In Avignon, where the Pope had moved his court, 400 people died each day. The air reeked of smoke, incense, and decay. The bells of the dead rang constantly until even the living stopped listening. There were not enough priests to give last rites, not enough gravediggers to bury the corpses. In some towns, pits were dug outside the walls, filled with hundreds of bodies at once and sealed with quicklime. Wood became more precious than gold, not for construction, but for coffins. And yet, humanity refused to surrender quietly. Across Europe, people turned to science, superstition, and faith in desperate combination. Doctors wore long leather coats and bird-like masks, stuffed with herbs and spices, rosemary, lavender, and cloves, believing they purified the bad air. They were wrong about the cause, but their crude gear gave some protection, the first true protective suits in medical history. Communities began fumigating their homes with smoke and vinegar. Money was soaked in wine before exchange. Letters were passed through incense before opening. And in one corner of France, a legend was born, the vinegar of the four thieves, a potion of garlic, sage, and spices said to protect against infection. It still exists today as a symbol of medieval ingenuity in the face of terror. Even amid despair, humor flickered, dark, biting, and strangely human. Songs and jokes about the plague spread almost as fast as the disease itself. The nursery rhyme, "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies," is believed to echo that time. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. A macabre reminder that laughter was, in its own way, an act of defiance. But perhaps the most haunting creation of the era was not a cure but an image, the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. Artists began painting skeletons, dancing hand in hand with kings, merchants, and peasants, a reminder that death spared no one. On church walls, parchment, and even musical scores, the same message appeared again and again: Memento mori. Remember that you will die. By the end of 1349, entire cities had vanished. Paris lost half its people. Florence, once a jewel of the Renaissance, fell silent. Across Europe, as many as 25 million lives were gone, nearly half the continent's population. And yet, in the ashes of death, change was already taking root. Labor became valuable again. Peasants, once bound to the land, began demanding wages. Feudal lords lost power. The Black Death did not just kill millions, it dismantled the medieval world itself. When the plague finally receded, Europe was smaller, poorer, but also freer. The survivors had stared into the abyss and lived to rebuild, and from the darkness of 1348 and 1349, a new world would slowly begin to rise. The chronicles begin with a strange sentence: "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon throughout the whole year." That line was written by the Byzantine historian Procopius, describing the year 536, a time when the heavens themselves seemed to turn against humanity. No one knew it then, but a massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, had filled the atmosphere with ash and sulfur. The sun dimmed. The sky took on a cold, silvery hue. For 18 months the world bathed in twilight. Birds stopped singing, crops refused to grow. People looked to the heavens and whispered that Judgment Day had come. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, temperatures plummeted. Even in summer, frost clung to the fields. In China, it snowed in June. The Irish annals recorded a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. In Scandinavia, entire villages vanished. Archaeologists have found their homes abandoned, as if everyone had simply walked away. Famine spread faster than the ash itself. With no crops, livestock starved. With no livestock, people followed. The global temperature drop between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2.5 degrees Celsius was enough to trigger the coldest decade in 2,300 years. The earth was silent, the air thick and grey. It was as if the sun had died. Imagine waking up every day beneath a dim orange disk in the sky, barely visible through the haze. Daylight looked like dusk. Even midday felt like twilight. The stars were invisible, the moon barely a whisper. To medieval people, who saw the sky as the language of God, this was not a natural disaster. It was divine punishment. But out of the fear came invention. Desperate to survive, communities began preserving food like never before. They salted fish, smoked meat, and learned to ferment vegetables to stretch supplies through the endless darkness. Salt, once common, became as valuable as silver. This crisis changed trade forever, creating new markets for preservation and storage that would define the medieval economy for centuries. In monasteries, monks kept meticulous records of the strange weather. They began charting the stars and the calendar more carefully, trying to predict when the light might return. Unknowingly, they laid the groundwork for the more accurate medieval astronomical and agricultural calendars that followed. Faith, observation, and necessity merged into science. The darkness also forged unexpected solidarity. With kingdoms weakened, local communities became lifelines. Monks distributed food to villagers. Families shared dwindling stores. In a world without sunlight, cooperation became survival. But the worst was yet to come. Just 5 years later, in 541, the Plague of Justinian would strike, carried through the same weakened trade networks that the famine had disrupted. The combination of volcanic winter, famine, and plague created what historians call the late antique Little Ice Age, a century of misery that reshaped civilization. Recent ice core samples from Greenland have confirmed the event with chilling precision. Layers of volcanic glass, traces of sulfur, and chemical signatures matching eruptions from Iceland and Central America. The Earth, quite literally, had choked on its own breath, and yet humanity endured. When the skies finally cleared, new forests began to grow where old ones had died. Crops slowly returned. The people who survived had become harder, wiser, and far more resourceful. They had learned to adapt to a planet that could turn on them without warning. As historian Michael McCormick of Harvard once said, 536 marked the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. But it was also the year that tested and proved the resilience of the human spirit. And if you want to dive even deeper into the mystery of 536, the volcanic winter, and the apocalypse that followed, don't miss our full documentary here on the channel, entirely dedicated to the year the sun disappeared. Because this single year, more than any other, shows how close humanity once came to the edge of extinction, and how, against all odds, we survived. By the early 1360s, Europe was breathing again. The first wave of the Black Death had passed. Cities were rebuilding, churches were filling, and people dared to hope that the nightmare was finally over. But in 1361, the bells began to toll once more. The plague had returned, and this time it came for the children. The pestis secunda, as it would later be called, was not as catastrophic as the Black Death, but it was just as cruel. It targeted those who had been too young to live through the first outbreak, a generation born in the shadow of death, now facing it head-on. To them, the stories their parents told, about streets filled with corpses and priests blessing mass graves, were no longer legends, they were prophecy. The symptoms were the same: high fever, delirium, swollen buboes, and death within days. But something in the air felt different. The survivors of the first plague had become strangely immune, while the children, pure, unexposed, defenseless, fell one after another. It was as if death itself had returned to finish what it had started. In England, chroniclers wrote of entire villages losing every child. In France, merchants shut their doors again, remembering the smell of 1348. In Portugal and Spain, entire parishes went silent. The Dr. Raymond Chalmel de Vinario, physician to the Pope, wrote in anguish that, although less fatal than before, the disease returned to claim those whom nature had spared. The psychological blow was immense. For survivors of the first wave, it felt like betrayal, as though all their prayers, all their faith had been for nothing. Art from the time shows skeletons leading children by the hand, laughing as they dance through villages, the continuation of the Danse Macabre, that grim medieval symbol of death's equality. No age, no rank, no innocence could save you. But this second wave brought something new: awareness. By now people had learned patterns. They noticed the disease spread faster in crowded areas, and that isolation worked. Authorities began marking infected homes with red crosses. Mothers sent their children to relatives in the countryside, hoping the wind would spare them. For the first time, mortality was not simply accepted, it was studied. The repetition of the plague also transformed society. Labor shortages, already severe after the Black Death, became critical. In England, wages rose sharply as peasants demanded payment for their work. When King Edward III tried to freeze wages by law, rebellion brewed. By 1381, the peasants' revolt would erupt, a direct child of plague and despair. Out of tragedy came progress. Monks and city officials began keeping detailed lists of the dead, the first death registers in European history. These bills of mortality became tools to track disease, laying the groundwork for modern public health records. Doctors started recording case studies systematically, comparing symptoms and outcomes. Medicine was still crude, but curiosity had replaced blind terror. Even technology advanced in unexpected ways. To measure the timing of medical treatments and prayers for the dying, monks and scholars developed the mechanical clock, a marvel of gears and precision that would redefine time itself. And in Italy, the invention of eyeglasses around 1280, now widely adopted, allowed aging physicians and scribes to continue their work, ensuring that no knowledge would be lost to failing eyesight. But perhaps the most striking change was spiritual. After 2 generations of plague, the medieval view of death shifted. People no longer saw it purely as punishment, but as part of life's natural rhythm. The dance of death became almost comforting, a reminder that kings and beggars alike shared the same fate. In the ashes of fear, a strange kind of peace emerged. By 1362, the second plague faded as mysteriously as it had arrived. Europe, smaller but unbroken, entered a new age, one that would lead, in time, to the Renaissance. The survivors, hardened by 2 generations of death, carried something the world had never seen before, not just faith, but understanding. The Pestis Secunda was more than a return of disease. It was a mirror, showing mankind what it had become after 20 years of apocalypse. And in that reflection, Europe saw both its fragility and its rebirth. Through famine and plague, through years without sunlight and skies without mercy, the Middle Ages tested the limits of human endurance. From the volcanic twilight of 536 to the endless funerals of 1362, every century seemed to whisper the same question: how much can humanity endure before it breaks? And yet time and again we refused to disappear. When the fields froze, we learned to preserve. When death swept through the cities, we learned to isolate. When darkness swallowed the sun, we learned to look within. Each disaster became a teacher, and every generation left behind not just bones and ruins, but lessons. Out of famine came trade. Out of plague came medicine. Out of death came art. The Middle Ages, often called dark, were in truth the forge where modern civilization was born, hammered by suffering, shaped by faith, and polished by resilience. So the next time you look back at history and wonder how they survived, remember, they didn't just survive, they adapted, and because they did, we're here to tell their story. If you enjoyed this journey through the darkest years of the Middle Ages, make sure to subscribe to Medieval Crazy History, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because history connects us all.